Published and developed by Pearl Abyss, Crimson Desert launched in March 2026 for PC, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S, and Mac OS. And after a near instant commercial success, where it sold 3 million copies in its first week, players were quickly enamored by the game's offering, despite its very obvious flaws. But regardless of that clear success, the critical reception told a very different and very inaccurate story. The confusion around the game really began years before release. Crimson Desert started as a planned prequel to Black Desert Online, Pearl Abyss's long-running MMORPG. In development, the scope changed and the studio pivoted to a standalone single-player experience. Pearl Abyss was explicit about what they were making, a sandbox action-adventure focused on exploration and experimentation. It was never pitched as a narrative-driven RPG, a Souls-like challenge gauntlet, or a story you play through once for the plot. The studio communicated this clearly in interviews and marketing materials. Critics either didn't listen or didn't believe them. The reviews that followed reflected this massive disconnect, and outlets approached Crimson Desert expecting traditional RPG progression systems like experience points, character levels, and skill trees unlocked through leveling. They found none of these things. The game has no XP in the traditional sense. You don't really gain character levels, and your power scaling comes almost entirely from gear refinement and Abyss artifacts. Critics also expected a tightly paced narrative structure and punishing difficulty that rewarded mastery of specific combat patterns. They found neither. Instead, they encountered a game that prioritized environmental discovery over quest completion and combat experimentation over memorizing boss patterns. This mismatch between expectation and reality produced reviews that criticized Crimson Desert for not being something it never claimed to be. Critics complained about the lack of traditional healing items, for example, without understanding that food is the only healing source. Understanding what Crimson Desert actually is changes how you evaluate it. This is a game where the open world is the primary content, where progression comes from finding better gear and earning Abyss artifacts rather than earning experience points, and where combat rewards creative use of mechanics like environmental hazards and weapon switching rather than perfect execution of optimal strategies. The story exists as a framework for exploration. Bosses are obstacles you overcome through gear progression and preparation rather than pure skill checks that demand dozens of attempts. If you approach this game expecting The Witcher 3 or Elden Ring, you will be disappointed. But if you approach it as a sandbox where the world itself is the attraction and discovery is the gameplay loop, it makes complete sense and is a hell of a lot of fun. The open world of Pywel is Crimson Desert's greatest achievement, and the world design is the biggest reason the game works at all. Everything else exists to support exploration, and the environment rewards that exploration consistently enough to justify the focus. You can't play for 5 minutes without being pulled off whatever objective you were pursuing because something in the world caught your attention and turned out to be worth investigating. Pywel is designed with extreme verticality and seamless integration between regions. You can see distant landmarks from almost anywhere in the world, and those landmarks aren't decorative. You can see a structure on a cliff face or a cave entrance halfway up a mountain, you can reach it. The game doesn't gate exploration behind story progression or arbitrary requirements. If you want to climb that tower in the distance, you climb it. Though, you might want to be careful about running into hidden bosses, armies of robots, the occasional dragon, and giant mechanical pterosaurs. The world invites interaction rather than observation, and it delivers on that invitation with discoverable content that feels genuinely hidden rather than marked on a checklist. On the other hand, Crimson Desert includes exploration mechanics it doesn't explain very well, if at all, which means you'll often discover them through experimentation or miss them entirely. Guiding Light, for example, is the most important of these. When you unsheath your sword and trigger the ability, a faint glow appears that reveals hidden secrets, concealed paths, buried treasure locations, and other similar things. White question mark markers appear throughout the world map and indicate fast travel points and hidden puzzles, and they only appear once you've discovered them using Guiding Light. These markers aren't quest objectives, they're environmental discoveries that reward investigation with permanent fast travel nodes or puzzle solutions that unlock gear and materials. More subtle clues exist as well. Stacks of rocks near waterfalls signal hidden caves behind the waterfall itself. You have to use your stab move to penetrate the waterfall and access those caves or treasure rooms that are completely invisible from the outside. The game teaches you none of this. You either notice the pattern or you walk past dozens of hidden areas without realizing they exist. Every region contains these sorts of environmental rewards that encourage you to engage with the terrain rather than following quest markers. Gear upgrades sit in chests, tucked into cliff alcoves that require careful climbing to access, or occasionally in the skeletal teeth of long-dead giants. Caves behind waterfalls that we mentioned already contain some of the best gear in the game: crafting materials, ore deposits, rare herbs, and some of the rarer Palmar pills that fully heal you when you resurrect. All these areas can be easily missed if you don't look for the in-world indicators. You find content because you choose to explore, and the reward feels earned because the game trusted you to look on your own. The world also encourages interaction with its inhabitants in ways most open world games don't. Vendors restock their entire inventory at midnight every in-game day, which means you can return to the same merchant repeatedly to buy materials, food, or gear without waiting for arbitrary cooldown timers or having them have an infinite stock. NPCs in towns and remote locations can carry unmarked bounties and contracts that you'll discover by talking to them rather than by following quest markers. The game doesn't highlight these NPCs or indicate which ones have bounties available. You find them by exploring settlements and initiating conversations, or by spotting wanted posters attached to walls or pillars in the area. The Greymane camp, established at Howling Hill during Chapter 3, serves as your central fast travel and storage hub, and can also serve as your main crafting location. This is your single permanent base upgraded through the Scattered Embers questline. Once sufficiently upgraded, the camp contains a farm, a ranch, a blacksmith, and storage of multiple kinds. You manage recruits and send them on dispatch missions for passive income and resources. Fast traveling to and from discovered locations is unlimited, which makes the camp the logistical center of your entire playthrough. Completing quests with different factions creates alliances that grant camp benefits: access to unique items sold by specific merchants across the continent, discounts on crafting materials, or new recruits for dispatch mission, or upgrades to camp facilities. What makes this design work is how consistently the world rewards curiosity. Exploration in Pywel turns up gear, materials, secrets, environmental storytelling, and systems the game rarely explicitly teaches. The density of discoverable content means you're constantly being pulled off the critical path because the world keeps offering reasons to deviate. The difference between Pywel and the typical open world environment is the absence of artificial engagement mechanics. There are no icons to collect on a map, no outposts that respawn enemies without any kind of reason, and no glowing breadcrumb trails leading to predetermined discoveries. The environment rewards attention with content that exists for its own sake, and that approach is rare enough and fun enough to carry the entire game. Crimson Desert's combat is visceral, combo-driven, and built around experimentation. The game gives you multiple weapon types with distinct movesets, environmental interactions that matter in fights, and physics-based mechanics that reward creative play. You aren't simply learning boss patterns and executing perfect dodges on precise timing windows. You're figuring out how to use the available systems to approach combat in ways that feel effective to you. The fun factor is central to that design, and RKOing multiple enemies in a row before demolishing the rest of their squad never gets old. The combat depth comes from understanding how those systems interact. You can switch weapons mid-combo without breaking your attack chain once you unlock the quick swap ability through the armed combat skill line. This allows you to open a combo with a greatsword for heavy damage, then switch to dual blades mid-string to maintain pressure with faster attacks. The combo chain continues seamlessly across weapon swaps, which creates hybrid strategies that would be impossible with weapon-locked combat. The grappling system extends your close-quarter options even further. You can grapple enemies off horses, dismounting them and leaving them briefly stunned. You can grapple human-sized enemies in close quarters to initiate throws or positioning moves that set up follow-up attacks. Grappling doesn't work on larger enemies or bosses, but against standard human opponents, it adds another layer of tactical flexibility and a hell of a lot of fun. The Lariat gives you a dedicated crowd control tool that works independently of your equipped weapon. Activate it while sprinting towards an enemy and knock them down, and you leave them vulnerable, creating an opening for ground attacks that deal bonus damage to prone targets. This works on most human-sized enemies, as I mentioned before, and provides a reliable way to create offensive windows windows when you're fighting large groups. Pulling off multiple RKOs and suplexes isn't only some of the most satisfying attacks you can accomplish, but they also do serious damage and have incredible AoE effects when paired with the right abyssal gear. They can easily turn the tide in combat when you're about to get overwhelmed by large groups of enemies. Environmental hazards matter in combat a great deal. Positioning enemies near pillars allows you to slam them into the structure for bonus damage, or use the pillars themselves and slam them into your enemies. Explosive barrels scattered throughout combat arena detonate when hit by any attack, creating area of effect damage that affects everyone nearby. Though you'll have to be careful because unlike most video games, they're not red and very obvious. Lightning effects deal bonus damage to wet enemies, which creates opportunities for synergy when fighting near water or during the heavy rain. These are very consistent mechanics you can use in any encounter where the appropriate hazards and weather effects exist. They're not scripted set pieces or events. All your weapon combos have fixed sequences that vary by weapon type. You can only switch stances, dodge, or use skills after a combo ender. Positioning distance really affects your damage output, enabling to trade hits safely when using heavy or fast attack. Once you understand a lot of these core mechanics, you can apply them across the entire game. Super armor mechanics force you to adjust your approach against certain enemies, in particular bosses. When an enemy has super armor active, a yellow glow appears around the body. During those frames, the enemy can't be staggered or really damaged by your attacks. You need to recognize these states and either dodge the incoming attack or reposition rather than continuing your combo and take damage. Stamina management exists, but doesn't restrict your combat rhythm the way Souls-like games do. Stamina does drain when you dodge, sprint, or perform certain heavy attacks, and it regenerates reasonably quickly. Running out of stamina doesn't leave you completely defenseless though. You simply can't perform stamina-consuming actions until it recovers. This creates a more forgiving combat flow where stamina is a resource you manage rather than a strict limiter that dictates your entire approach, and there are plenty of resources, builds, and food items that can increase your stamina and increase your stamina regen, especially once you've permanently increased your stamina in the skill tree. The block and parry system uses the same input, which can get confusing sometimes. Holding the button blocks incoming attacks and reduces damage. Timing the press just before an attack lands executes a parry, which negates damage entirely and creates a counterattack window. Some attacks are unblockable, and these tend to be telegraphed with specific visual indicators and animations. These have to be avoided using a dodge roll or dodge sidestep or getting out of the way however you can. Attempting to block or parry an unblockable attack will just result in full damage and a stagger, and you do not want that. Enemy AI is where things get a bit wonky. Most normal enemies are really stupid, but they don't take turns attacking, so you'll be constantly dealing with multiple attackers coming from multiple angles and doing as much damage as they possibly can. This is especially true of archers, who are unironically some of the most irritating and dangerous enemies when you're fighting larger groups, because they will maintain effective distances while constantly taking shots at you with seemingly infinite arrows. Bosses in particular can stun lock you with chained attacks that have little cooldown between hits. If your armor hasn't been refined enough, you can get caught in damage loops where the boss lands one hit, follows up before you recover, and chains attacks until you die without you ever regaining control of the fight. This is a gear check more than anything. The game expects you to have reached a certain power threshold before fighting specific bosses, and falling short makes the encounter significantly harder because the boss's damage output and attack speed outpace your ability to recover between hits. The skill-oriented nature of combat comes from mastering the mechanics themselves rather than mastering individual encounters. You learn how weapon combos flow, how environmental interactions work, how positioning affects damage and crowd control, and how gear upgrades change your effective power level. Once you understand these systems, you can apply that knowledge to any fight. Crimson Desert wants you to engage with these mechanics and experiment with combination. It doesn't want you to memorize attack patterns and execute flawless dodges in every encounter. Whether that approach appeals to you determines whether combat delivers or disappoints, and for me, it certainly did deliver. Crimson Desert has no traditional experience point system and no character levels. Power scales through gear refinement and Abyss artifact. Abyss artifacts artifacts serve as the core progression resource. You spend them to unlock and upgrade skills to refine gear beyond certain levels. Sealed Abyss artifacts are the most common type. You find them scattered across the map in specific locations, on the ground, in chests, hidden in caves, tucked into cliff alcoves, occasionally on a person's food cupboard. Collecting them is necessary for certain challenges and content gates, which means exploration directly feeds into progression. Faded Abyss artifacts function as the respec currency. One Faded Abyss artifact resets your skill tree completely, which lets you experiment with different builds freely without worrying about permanent choices or being locked in. Standard Abyss artifacts provide the main resource for progression. These are rarer in the early game until you learn the ways to earn and farm them. They typically come from completing significant content like boss fights, difficult exploration challenges, or hidden quest lines, but they can also be earned in other ways, such as discovering locations, solving environmental puzzles, killing hordes of enemies, or pickpocketing all the scholars at the Scholar Stone Institute. Pro tip, you can do that quite a bit. Once you do understand all these methods, they can be farmed indefinitely through continued play, which removes the traditional RPG anxiety of wasting skill points on the wrong abilities. You can always get more, and you'll eventually have enough to max out all 3 skill trees for all 3 playable characters, but this will still take a whole bunch of time and a whole bunch of grind to accomplish. Gear refinement is the other major progression system. Refinement costs scale with item rarity. Common gear requires basic materials found through normal exploration. Rare and legendary gear demands significantly more materials and higher costs, making top-tier upgrades a very long-term investment. Most weapons and armor have very similar base stats when fully refined, but what makes gear meaningful is the Abyss gear attached to it. Abyss gear provides stat increases and special abilities that define your build. Boss weapons are particularly valuable because they tend to come with unique Abyss gear already slotted in them, and these are build-defining effects, not just minor bonuses. The absence of traditional leveling means there's no stat bloat and no objectively optimal build path. You choose gear based on the abyssal gear slotted into it, and you'll select skills that support how you want to play. The game doesn't penalize unconventional choices. Build diversity comes from the variety of Abyss gear available and the freedom to experiment without being locked into permanent decisions. Build customization itself comes from that Abyss gear combination rather than base stat differences. Health and stamina really will be early priorities because they'll directly affect your survivability, combat options, and exploration. So it's always good to invest early in them to expand your exploration range and give you more defensive and offensive options in fights. Once you start gaining a good collection of Abyss gear with special techniques, you can really start stretching your character builds into truly overpowered directions. The game offers multiple layered systems for obtaining Abyss gear. You acquire these powerful socketable enhancements by defeating enemies across the open world, with particularly strong results from dedicated farming loops, such as the shielded mace wielders at Icewatch Altar in the Spire Forest region. After combat, you can extract the embedded Abyss gears from looted weapons and armor at any unlocked Witch's workshop. Treasure chests hidden in various ruins and the Abyss itself frequently contain pre-socketed pieces or unique variants that the witches themselves won't sell you. Story progression and side quests also reward specific gears, whilst back alley masked goblin merchants in cities sell a few rare examples for significant coin. Once you've reached chapter 5 and unlock the full set of witches, starting with Sylvia in Shadow's Whisper Cave, you gain access to crafting and special synthesis, where you combine low-tier gears using collected materials and blueprints earned through exploration, mission dispatches, and further quest lines to create higher tiers with improved effects. This combination of direct looting, extraction, and witch-based synthesis forms the complete cycle for building strong Abyss gear sets. Most importantly, you as the player aren't locked into using specific equipment just because it carries the effects or stats you need for your build, because the majority of effects are in the Abyss gear themselves, which gives you a lot of creative freedom when it comes to what combinations of weapons, armor, and Abyss gear you can use for the greatest effect while looking absolutely boss while doing it. In addition to these progression systems, and somewhat less important, is weapon sharpening and armor reinforcement, which is free and available at grindstones and anvil stations found in a variety of locations across the map. Sharpening temporarily increases your weapon's damage output without consuming any materials, and reinforcement gives you a temporary boost to armor, allowing you to tank more damage before your health bar depletes. Interestingly, both buffs last for a limited number of hits as opposed to having a specific time limit, meaning you can use them whenever you want and you won't run out of the buffs until they get used during combat. While it is a lesser mechanic when you're looking at your entire character build, they're incredibly good at giving you an extra edge in combat when attempting more difficult and challenging boss fights or enemy areas. Now, these systems aren't without problems. Sealed Abyss artifacts are plentiful and give you a great reason for exploring every nook and cranny you can find, but completing their challenges is frankly quite boring, incredibly repetitive, and obviously a mechanic learned from the developer's previous experience creating content for an MMORPG. The game also does a poor job of explaining all of its many and sundry mechanics. It doesn't tell you how different types of Abyss artifact or Abyss gear affect progression, or where to find the materials needed for higher level equipment refinement. It doesn't tell you that sharpening is free until far after you encounter your first anvil and grindstone, or that Abyss gear is the primary differentiator between equipment pieces, or that the majority of equipment is very similar from a stat perspective, or provide a better in-game way to manage equipment and Abyss gear without having to visit a witch for every action. These are mechanics you'll learn through play rather than through explicit instruction, which creates friction for players who expect the game to teach its systems up front, clearly, and in good time. I mean, the underlying design choices for all of these mechanics really are sound. Progression without strict numbers gives you freedom to define your own playstyle. The Abyss gear system provides meaningful build customization without requiring you to follow an optimal path or chase stat breakpoints. That freedom is central to what makes Crimson Desert work as a sandbox adventure, but the developers could have done a better job making the game itself less of a puzzle to figure out so that players could properly engage with everything on offer. You begin and complete the vast majority of the main story exclusively as Cliff McDuff. The other two characters unlock via story progression and can be freely swapped in the open world, both to play and for specific challenges and quests requiring specific characters to accomplish. All the characters share the same core pool of Abyss artifacts and points, but each has a completely independent skill tree, unique weapon sets, movesets, and playstyle focus. This allows the possibility for 3 distinct character builds and playstyles, but the shared pool of skill points can get very frustrating very quickly, especially earlier on in the game when you have less points to use and you're forced to respec other trees just to be able to put points into a character you want to switch to. Cliff's skill tree is the largest and most well-rounded, with branches dedicating to close combat chains, archery, athletic traversal like force palm and grappling, and defensive options. Damien unlocks mid-chapter 3 through the reunion quest line. She brings a fast, aggressive glass cannon style built around rapier lunges, dual blades, firearms, and high mobility. Her tree emphasizes dodge chains, aerial options, and hybrid melee range bursts, making her particularly strong once mastered. Unka joins later in the Greymane reunion arc around chapter 7 to 9. As the Orc Brute, he focuses more on raw destruction with warhammers, axes, and bare-handed martial arts, delivering heavy area of effect slams and massive sustain. Equipment is also character-specific, which forces you to maintain separate loadouts for each, but this isn't a huge impediment because there's plenty of gear for each character to use. The observe to learn mechanic carries over permanently across respecs and characters, rewarding you for paying attention to enemy moves regardless of who you're controlling at the time. Overall, the companion system adds welcome variety to both combat and exploration, and the freedom to experiment with different playstyles while reinforcing the sandbox nature of the game without forcing you down a single path. Climbing, gliding, and platforming are core traversal mechanics in Crimson Desert. The extreme verticality and general size of Pywel means these systems are absolutely essential to exploration. You can't engage with the world design without using them constantly, but the execution has serious problems that undermine the entire traversal experience. The vertical world design often demands precise traversal, and while they're a lot of fun when they work perfectly, these systems don't always deliver that precision as consistently as you want. For example, climbing requires you to grab onto walls, but there is no automatic context-sensitive grab. You have to actively press the jump button while facing a climbable surface to initiate the climbing state. This isn't the worst interaction, but sometimes that input doesn't register even when you're attempting to grab a surface that should be clearly clearly climbable and when you've pressed the button at the right time. Quite often, you'll sprint directly into a wall, press jump, and Cliff just won't grab it. This failure to register the input happens frequently enough to become a constant source of friction during exploration, particularly on rugged mountains where the climbable surfaces should be obvious. Climbing also drains stamina continuously, which means you can't scale tall structures without managing your stamina bar carefully or finding ledges to rest on during the ascent. Again, this isn't the worst mechanic, but it is incredibly limiting, particularly in the early game, when players don't have enough resources to invest into stamina. Mantling adds another layer of inconsistency. Auto-mantle doesn't trigger reliably on certain corners and edges. You have to manually press jump to trigger that mantle animation, and sometimes the mantle fails to trigger entirely even when you're clearly positioned at a ledge that should allow it and you've pressed the button at the right time. You'll be hanging on a climbable surface, trying to pull yourself up on a platform above, and the game just won't respond to your input, causing you to fall because the mantle didn't register, not because you failed to use the inputs correctly, and that gets incredibly frustrating. Gliding drains stamina continuously while you're airborne. The drain rate is affected by things like altitude and momentum, so gliding at high speed drains stamina faster than gliding horizontally or slightly upward using momentum from a high starting point. Landing on target platforms requires precise stamina prediction because running out of stamina mid-glide causes you to fall, often to your death. The game doesn't explain how altitude and momentum affect stamina drain, which means you'll learn these mechanics through trial and error, again, often by falling to your death when stamina runs out unexpectedly during a particularly long glide. Force palm gives you access to a triple jump that extends your vertical reach during platforming. Using force palm in this way allows you to jump 3 times in succession while airborne, extending airtime and letting you reach platforms inaccessible with a standard jump. The timing window for each button press is fairly tight, but it's not the most difficult technique to pull off. For the best effect, you need to activate force palm at the apex of each jump to maintain upward momentum and get as high as you can. The game never really teaches you that this mechanic exists, but reasonably experienced gamers will discover it by experimenting with it while jumping and airborne fairly quickly. Precision jump allows for smaller controlled leaps instead of full jumps, which reduces stamina drain compared to normal jumping. This is pretty critical during extended platforming sequences in the abyss, where you need to make multiple jumps in succession without depleting stamina and while transferring from very small platforms to another small platform. The momentum system makes precise movement nearly impossible. Cliff overshoots when you try to stop precisely. When you release the analog stick, he doesn't stop immediately. He continues moving forward for a few steps. This compounds during precision platforming sections where you need to land on a specific spot or stop at the edge of a platform, and you'll often find yourself overshooting your intended position repeatedly because the momentum system doesn't allow for immediate stops. Simple platforming can become a frustrating exercise in overcompensation and far too many repeated attempts. Sliding down hills saves stamina compared to sprinting or running, which makes it really useful for traversing down slopes really quickly. The transition between sliding and other movement states can feel inconsistent unless you get your timing down perfectly. Often you'll slide down a hill, try to transition into a jump or a sprint, and the game won't respond smoothly to the input change because you haven't done it at the exact time it expects you to, and it's fairly unforgiving in that regard. Camera and field of view issues make vertical traversal harder still. The field of view is far too narrow, which creates a sense of claustrophobia during tight platforming sections, and the camera doesn't adjust well to vertical spaces or confined environments. Sometimes it'll end up pointing directly into walls, making Cliff completely invisible and forcing you to navigate blind for a few moments. During precision jumps, you often can't see your landing point because the camera angle doesn't provide a clear view of the platform below, so you'll find yourself making jumps based on guesswork rather than visual confirmation and precision. All of these flaws in movement mechanics are more than just minor inconveniences and are genuinely fundamental problems that affect every aspect of exploration. The world is designed around vertical traversal, which means you're constantly engaging with systems that don't always work reliably and occasionally show quirks that simply make no sense. For example, basic actions like climbing certain kinds of stairs add a very strange crouching animation that slows you down as if you were scaling a steep cliff. There are input delays that appear across a whole bunch of different actions and compound those issues with climbing and platforming in a confusing and somewhat janky mess. The jank that affects climbing and mantling is particularly noticeable when climbing the sides of buildings as opposed to more complex terrain like cliffs and mountain sides. Pets and mounts form an essential support layer that ties directly into exploration, combat, and daily life in Pywel. Stray dogs or cats found across towns and wild areas, as well as birds attracted by the bird feeder item, can all be befriended as permanent auto-looting followers. Trust builds through daily petting and feeding specific favorite foods until that level reaches 100. Once the pet is adopted, they'll follow you automatically and they'll vacuum up all dropped loot. This will dramatically reduce the amount of time you take at the end of combat to pick everything up, as well as what ends up in the supply chest. Horses go further still. You can tame wild ones through a balanced minigame and then building trust via riding, petting, feeding. Higher trust levels unlock special skills and buffs like drifting, improved speed, swimming, double jump, and devastating rear kicks in combat. Legendary horses such as Roiler, for example, offer far superior stamina and speed, or the Rockade, which offers far greater durability, and they all are permanent summons once they've been tamed and registered. If your horse ever takes damage, it will move far slower and lose its ability to sprint properly. But you can easily heal an injured mount by smacking it with the healing palm ability, or by giving it a specific kind of healing potion, which are fairly easy to find across the game world. Later in the story, you'll get access to far more exotic options, including the Black Star Dragon, unlocked in Chapter 11. This powerful aerial mount lets you fly, breathe fire, and dive bomb enemies, though it does initially come with fairly restricted cooldowns until you complete additional quests that give you far less limited usage. Several of the legendary mounts support full combat movesets, turning Traversal into an extension of your fighting style, and some of them will even fight on their own when you're not mounted, but they're by your side. Together, these systems create a living loop where exploration feeds companions, companions support combat and resource gathering, and the results flow back into camp upgrades and further adventures. They reward consistent attention without feeling mandatory, and they deepen the sense that Pywel is a world that keeps rewarding you the longer you engage with it. Taming 30 unique pets even ties into certain life challenges, adding another layer of long-term progression and rewards. The Abyss is a sky realm of floating islands suspended above the main world. It offers a distinct environment with unique challenges and serves as a separate layer of exploration that breaks up the ground level content of Pywel. Functionally, this is where every platforming traversal problem in Crimson Desert becomes magnified to the point of genuine frustration. Platform spacing in the Abyss is designed around specific stamina thresholds that assume you've invested in stamina upgrades. Early sections feature platforms spaced at distances reachable with base stamina if you manage your skydive to glide transition correctly, and later sections increase spacing significantly, requiring either upgraded stamina or precise execution of stamina-conserving techniques like precision jump and a really precise gliding path. The game does teach you how to use precision jump, but it never really explains that platform spacing scales with expected stamina investment. You'll discover the latter through failure, running out of stamina mid-glide, falling into the void, and respawning at the last checkpoint. Try again if you didn't manage to hit the glide button right before hit the ground and going splat. Precision jump eventually becomes mandatory in the Abyss. The mechanic allows smaller controlled leaps, like we've mentioned before, and it consumes less stamina. This is critical when you're chaining multiple jumps across really narrow, small platforms suspended in the air, because using full jump, you'll not only run out of stamina partway through and potentially fall, but you'll also suffer the negative consequences of the momentum system and just step over the edge of something even though you stopped holding the analog stick forward. Puzzle design in the Abyss relies on mechanics the game never fully explains. One recurring type requires you to use Blinding Flash, a skill from the armed combat tree, to activate light-sensitive crystal nodes. When you approach some of these nodes, they'll glow faintly, and if you hit them with Blinding Flash, causes a bright pulse that can trigger nearby platforms, puzzle pieces, or things that extend or rotate you to jump onto. The game isn't very good at telling you what Blinding Flash will interact with, and it makes it very confusing to solve certain puzzles where you don't understand what tools are available to use at any given time. Another puzzle type requires you to use Force Palm to push weighted blocks, visually distinct with darker stone and glowing runes, onto pressure plates. The game doesn't explain very well that Force Palm can move them, but it's not too difficult to figure figure out. The worst part is that the physics can be inconsistent. Sometimes the block moves smoothly in the direction you push. Sometimes it slides at an angle because the surface is slightly uneven. And sometimes it doesn't move at all because you weren't positioned at the exact angle the game expects you to be. These puzzles are mandatory obstacles that block progress, and solving them requires either prior knowledge or extensive trial and error if you haven't figured out how some of these mechanics work. Those camera failures I mentioned earlier are worse in the Abyss than anywhere else in the game. Narrow vertical shafts cause the camera to clip into walls and lose track of Cliff entirely. You'll be climbing up a shaft, the camera will swing into the wall behind you and Cliff will disappear from view. Rotating can compound this. Some Abyss puzzles feature platforms that rotate continuously or rotate when you step on them. The camera doesn't track these rotations very smoothly. It jerks and stutters as the platform turns, making it very difficult to judge distances or plan your next jump. The gliding momentum system creates failure loops that are difficult to escape. You can launch yourself from a high platform, skydive towards a lower island, transition to a glide, and realize mid-flight that you misjudged the distance by only a foot or two. Stamina drains faster than expected because you transition too early or because you're gliding against the headwind, which increases stamina drain noticeably but is never explained. You can try to adjust your trajectory, but the momentum system doesn't allow for sharp turns. You overshoot the platform, and circling back requires sustained gliding, which drains the rest of your stamina, which means you'll fall, respawn at the last checkpoint, and repeat the sequence. These gliding mechanics don't provide enough control to recover from small mistakes, and the stamina drain rates punish experimentation rather than encouraging it, particularly in the early game. The Abyss does teach some mechanics explicitly while leaving others completely untaught. It shows you how to skydive and how to transition from skydive to glide. It doesn't teach you how momentum affects stamina drain during that transition. It doesn't really teach you that precision jump not only exists but is a requirement. It doesn't teach you that force palm push weighted blocks, but only if you're positioned in the exact perfect spot. It doesn't teach you that blinding flash can activate more than just light sensitive crystals, or that certain platforms require the triple jump to reach. The inconsistency between what the game teaches and what it expects you to know and figure out through experimentation runs throughout the entire area and the game. Skydiving is going to be your primary traversal method for leaving the Abyss. You launch yourself off from high platforms, free fall towards the continent, and then transition to a glide to control your descent and land where you want. Stamina drain during skydiving itself is non-existent, and when combined with skilled gliding, it becomes the most stamina efficient way to cover massive map distances quickly. The transition from skydive to glide is where the system starts to break down a bit, because when you pull out of a skydive, your momentum carries forward and stamina drain immediately increases to those normal gliding levels. If you transition too early and you waste stamina gliding when you could still be skydiving, you will die. When you transition too late and you overshoot your landing and have to circle back, you'll drain more stamina in the process, potentially running out in midair, and you'll die. It's down to the player to learn the optimal transition timing and how momentum affects your glide path after exiting a skydive, and when you really learn how to use this set of skills, you'll be taking advantage of it as often as possible, while admittedly having a lot of fun doing it. The visual design of the Abyss is quite striking, but not overly original. The islands are reasonably distinct in the way they're shaped and have to be traversed, the skybox is impressive, and the sense of scale it adds to the world works incredibly well, especially since it's combined with the game's incredibly large draw distances. Much like other aspects of the game's design and mechanics, the concept for the Abyss is sound. It's a sky realm with floating islands using vertical and horizontal traversal challenges and environmental puzzles as an alternate set of gameplay experiences the player has access to, and that's a really strong idea. But the movement systems aren't precise enough to handle the platforming demands, and while most of the puzzles are reasonably easy to figure out and complete, there are a few that aren't explained clearly enough within the game world to make solutions feel like discovery rather than guesswork, and that camera doesn't function well enough in tight vertical spaces to provide the visual information you need when elements of those puzzles are out of sight. Crimson Desert has 12 chapters plus post-story content. The narrative follows Cliff Macduff, a mercenary leader navigating the political conflicts and personal struggles in the war-torn continent of Pywel. The story exists as a framework for exploration rather than as the primary content, and the game is designed to accommodate players who treat it that way. The pacing is very slow, especially during the first 4 chapters, chapters, and the main quest doesn't drive you forward with any real urgency. You can, and I did, spend hours between story missions exploring the world, completing side activities, and engaging with life skills without feeling like you're neglecting the plot. The game rewards exploring between chapters more than it rewards following the main quest, and the story is there when you want to progress it, but it doesn't demand your attention or penalize you for ignoring it. The writing quality varies a great deal, with some character moments work really well, particularly interactions with secondary characters and some of the camp dialogues, whilst others tend to be quite trite and very derivative. The richest narrative content exists in many of these smaller optional conversations, rather than the main plot beats. And while the main story hits very familiar beats without subversion or surprise, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's not taking any risks or doing anything particularly interesting with its overall narrative either. Cliff's personality and motivations are somewhat underdeveloped in the main story, and supporting characters appear briefly, deliver exposition, and then disappear for multiple chapters. That said, I did grow to appreciate Cliff's stoic and kind nature, which led him to help as many people as he could, even if he wasn't the greatest conversationalist. The narrative isn't bad, it's simply not the focus of the game design, and Pearl Abyss was explicit about this during development, and the final product reflects that priority. And if you approach Crimson Desert expecting a tightly paced narrative and story with strong character arcs and meaningful plot developments, you'll be pretty disappointed. But if you approach it as a sandbox where the story gives structure to your exploration, it works exactly as intended and will give you an excellent experience. Life skills in Crimson Desert include fishing, crafting, cooking, hunting, and camp management. These aren't really optional side systems. They integrate with exploration and progression in ways that directly affect your ability to survive combat encounters and afford gear upgrades. The game barely explains how they all work, which does create a certain amount of friction, but the underlying design, like much of the other mechanics, are very solid. Fishing is a reliable early income source, and it will be the primary supplier of healing items because of the cooking system. When using your fishing rod, you'll cast it by holding the cast button until the power meter fills and then release. Once cast, you wait for the bite indicator and start reeling the fish in. Fish vary by region and water type. Rivers and lakes in the early Hernand region commonly yield species like trout, tench, bass, and pond loach, which sell for modest amounts and cook into simple grilled or porridge dishes that restore a solid chunk of HP. In other areas like the Demonis region, you'll find northern pike, carp, and lannow, whilst coastal waters in Delecia and other waters in Pyloon offer mackerel, sea bream, and generally larger catches that fetch better prices and are stronger ingredients. Selling raw fish generates immediate silver but wastes their buff potential. Cooking fish into meals costs time and minor ingredients but produces far more valuable consumables, because food items not only restore health or spirit, they can also provide useful buffs like temporary resistance or regenerating. Much like fishing, you can also hunt by killing various different kinds of animal, from deer to rabbits to bears, oh my. And just like with fishing, they provide certain materials, different kinds of meat that provide different grades of ingredient. Just like with fishing, you can sell them for a small amount, but they're more valuable as cooking items. If you skip fishing and hunting entirely, you'll end up buying healing food and buff meals from merchants at a premium, and that adds up pretty fast. A tough boss fight can and will burn through stacks of food, and buying dishes, whilst useful, can get very expensive if you don't learn how to cook. Catching and cooking your own supply, on the other hand, costs almost nothing beyond a bit of bait high. Over a full playthrough, consistently fishing, hunting, and cooking can save you tens of thousands of silver that you can instead put towards gear refinement, abyss artifacts, camp upgrades, etc. And cooking itself requires understanding ingredient quality tiers, buff types, and fail rates the game doesn't tell you about. Ingredients come in 3 quality tiers: common, fine, and superior. Cooking with higher quality ingredients increases buff potency and duration, and more complex recipes create more complex foods that give you more healing, more regeneration, and better buffs. In addition to hunting, gathering, you also have the contribution system. Contribution acts as a regional reputational currency. You earn it through bounties, quests, clearing bandit camps, and helping locals, and you lose it by committing crimes. You spend these points at contribution shops, usually found in major settlements or castles, to buy exclusive regional gear, cosmetics, horse equipment, and other special items. Bounties can offer a solid stream of silver while boosting your regional contribution, and it's a system the game explains fairly poorly. Bounties don't follow strict numbered tiers with fixed rewards, but they do scale in value and difficulty. And the bounty mechanics themselves differ noticeably between capturing targets alive versus killing them. Bringing the target in alive by tackling them, beating a confession out of them, tying them up, and then delivering them to the nearest prison on horseback will grant full silver rewards plus maximum contribution. Killing the target or letting them die during transport only gives you half the silver and a reduced contribution score. Bounties scale with region and story progress, with early areas featuring simpler, lower reward targets with basic behaviors. Later regions introduce tougher outlaws with stronger defenses, more aggressive patterns, and trickier escape attempts. The rewards do scale accordingly, but the difficulty can spike pretty sharply. Failing by dying or letting the target escape usually forces you to track them down all over again. Camp management integrates all these life skills into a centralized progression system. You establish the Grey Main camp at Howling Hill during Chapter 3 through the Scattered Embers questline, and then farms, ranches, the blacksmith, alchemy lab, and multiple kinds of storage can all be built or upgraded. And dispatch missions send recruits on resource gathering expeditions that complete in real time, which lets you automate some of the resource gathering tedium while you focus on having fun and actually playing the game. These systems feed into each other in very specific, measurable ways, and all these life skills and camp mechanics are part of the core gameplay, and it's integrated with exploration and progression in ways that make the world feel more interactive and the time between combat encounters more purposeful. The lack of explanation of these systems is a genuine problem, but the systems themselves are reasonably well designed and worth engaging with once you understand how they work. Crimson Desert features a fully realized crime system that activates only after you equip a thieves mask. Without one, the prompts for stealing remain locked regardless of proximity to owned items or your ability to just pick them up with your bare hands. You can acquire a basic mask pretty cheaply from a back alley vendor near Hanand, or complete an early bounty, or loot one from random enemy drops when you defeat bandits. Stealing or committing crimes carries immediate and lasting penalties. Every theft deducts regional contribution points, even if they're undetected or unseen by any NPCs. When you steal something, a red search area appears around you after any sort of crime, including stealing, and the guards within it escalate the bounty if they spot you. Arrests result in heavy losses of both contribution and silver, potentially driving your balance negative and severely hindering progress in tight early game economies. The system is regional, so actions in Hanand have no direct impact in Demonis or other areas. Contribution acts as a hidden trust meter and can shape how the world responds to you. High contribution earned through faction quests, bounties, freeing captives, clearing bandit camps, and charitable acts earns respect from townsfolk, and that can unlock secrets, doors, exclusive ceremonial gear, new vendors, and improve dialogue options with certain NPCs. Low contribution paints you as a threat, closing off certain opportunities and triggering more hostile NPC behaviors. In practice, the crime system feels punitive and poorly tuned. It lacks meaningful player agency or satisfying risk-reward balance, and the requirement for a mask feels arbitrary. The contribution losses stack very quickly, and the regional separation prevents any cohesive outlaw fantasy. Exploration and camp building already demand significant time investment, so the constant threat of financial and reputational setbacks from minor unseen thefts or accidental guard aggro adds unnecessary frustration rather than tension. The mechanics need a ground-up rebuild to offer genuine choices instead of heavy-handed discouragement. And these systems clash with the game's greatest strength, its invitation to freely explore and experiment in a vibrant sandbox. While the intention to create consequences for actions is understandable, the execution makes crime feel like a trap rather than a viable path, pushing most players towards strictly honorable routes that limit variety until they realize that crime pays very well and that the system is easily manipulated. For example, if you want to make sure your contribution score is affected as little as possible, then it's best to go on a thieving spree across entire towns in a region and then recover all your lost contribution by doing various side quests and content afterwards. That red circled area I mentioned is really easily mitigated by staying very still after stealing objects while out of sight. As long as no one sees you while the circle is active, you won't be hunted by anyone. So it just becomes a matter of waiting for the timer bar to shrink to nothing and then move along once the circle is gone. Bosses in Crimson Desert have attack patterns and unique mechanics that are reasonably straightforward to understand once you encounter them. The problem isn't really mechanical complexity, because boss difficulty is almost entirely determined by whether you've kept pace with gear progression. Enter a fight with upgraded equipment and the encounter becomes manageable or easy. Enter undergeared and the fight feels brutally unfair, because bosses can often stun lock you with chained attacks that leave no room for counterplay. The game doesn't communicate what level of preparation is appropriate for each encounter, which means you discover you're undergeared by dying repeatedly, rather than by receiving any feedback that tells you to upgrade first. But as long as you are regularly keeping up with gear enhancement before getting into obvious boss fights, you'll find that each fight is actually quite easy. It's the surprise boss fights that occur when you accidentally find one during exploration that will really test you when you walk around unprepared. The stun locking problem is the core issue, and getting hit by certain attacks causes the worst kind of hit stun for the entire duration of the combo chain. You can't dodge, can't counterattack, or use items while the boss continues hitting you until the combo ends or you die. And a lot of boss combos chain multiple hits without pause between attacks, and each hit keeps you stun locked for a duration long enough that you take heavy damage with no counter available. Your armor rating dramatically affects survivability, with higher armor reducing incoming damage enough that you can survive full boss combos. This gives you the opportunity to heal and re-engage after the stun lock ends, but lower armor ratings mean you can't survive most boss combos, and you'll die before the combo finishes or very shortly after. Stamina management matters quite a bit in boss fights, but the stamina costs and regen rates are balanced around the assumption that you'll tank and parry hits rather than dodge every attack. Dodging consumes stamina, more stamina than parrying, and your stamina pool is limited. Bosses attack more frequently than your stamina regenerate, and they don't give you time to recover. Run out of stamina mid-fight and you can't dodge the next attack, which means you'll absorb the hit and likely get stun locked into a follow-up combo. Boss mechanics themselves vary and include unique scenarios that are reasonably straightforward to figure out once you encounter them. One fight, for example, involves a red fog entity with a diamond stone inside that you must shoot with your axiom force to damage. You hook shot it, you grab it, and then you chop chop chop. It's as common as an old Zelda game. Some bosses have armor break or dagger break mechanics that allow you to interrupt specific attacks or create openings. And when you're properly geared, you can brute force most encounters without engaging with most of these mechanics. But when you're undergeared, they become far more important to pay attention to. But the game doesn't explain them clearly enough to make discovering them feel like intentional design rather than trial error. Boss attack patterns are fairly easy to learn, and they telegraph their attack through wind-ups and animations, so once you see in a pattern a few times, you can recognize what's coming without too much difficulty. The difficulty isn't in learning those patterns, it's in surviving long enough to execute your responses when undergeared. Bosses transition between attacks so quickly and often chain combos directly into others with very minimal recovery frames, meaning that a single dodge after the final hit of one combo leaves very little time before the next attack begins. The gear wall is most visible at chapter transitions. Bosses are balanced around the assumption that you have collected and upgraded gear from exploration content before attempting each fight. Enter with appropriately upgraded gear and the encounter is straightforward. Enter with low tier gear from the previous chapter and the encounter becomes brutal. Players who skip exploration and rush the critical path hit this wall repeatedly, and it's one of the main reasons why game journals found boss encounters so hard. The game allows you to progress through chapters without forcing you to explore and collect gear upgrades, but the boss difficulty assumes you haven't done that. It assumes that you've gone out to explore and collect gear and refine your equipment. Most of the time, you aren't failing because you lack skill. You're failing because you're undergeared, and the game didn't tell you that being undergeared would make bosses nearly impossible unless you eat enough food to feed several armies. Crimson Desert performs quite well on a technical level, and the game runs pretty smoothly with stable frame rates, and FPS drops are fairly rare, even during intense combat encounters with multiple enemies on screen. Small environmental details do pop in at very close range, so things like flowers, birds, small objects will appear when you're nearly on top of them, which is particularly noticeable when you're searching for collectibles or gathering resources. So you'll find yourself scanning an area that looks slightly empty, and then suddenly flowers and gathering nodes appear as you walk through the space. The pop-in distance for these small objects is close enough that it undermines exploration a bit, because you can't see what's physically in the area under your feet until you're already standing in it. NPC duplication is another systematic problem. The same character model appears in multiple towns simultaneously, sometimes with identical clothing and equipment. The game uses a limited pool of NPC models assigned to multiple roles across different locations without multiple variation, and while this isn't the worst thing in the world, it does become noticeable after a while. Weather systems affect how gameplay works in specific ways. Rain reduces visibility and draw distance for environmental objects and NPCs quite noticeably. Wet surfaces cause you to slide after releasing movement input rather than stopping reasonably cleanly, which makes precise platforming in the rain even more difficult than it usually is. Fog during storms obscure distant landmarks, which can make navigation harder if you're relying on visual reference points rather than just the map. Cold weather and overly hot weather can drain stamina faster than normal conditions. In those kinds of regions without the appropriate gear or buffs, stamina depletes far more quickly during things like climbing, gliding, and sprinting, and the drain is noticeable enough to affect activities that would normally be easily manageable in other regions. And without enough resistances, you'll find that stamina depletes much faster than you'd expect. Elemental damage interactions exist, but are completely explained. For example, we talked about lightning strikes earlier. Some of these can occur randomly during rainstorms and deal damage on a direct hit. These tend to be preceded by a brief visual flash and audio cue. But standing in water during a rainstorm increases lightning damage, and using lightning damage in wet areas will increase its effective range and damage output, whilst fire-based attacks deal more damage in dry conditions and less damage when raining. The game communicates none of these interactions through UI or tutorials, so you'll have to discover them by noticing damage variations and experimenting to identify the cause. The core problem here is the gap between technical performance and immersion. The game runs smoothly and looks very good, but those smaller assets can just appear out of nowhere. The identical NPCs populating multiple locations can be a bit jarring, and key characters are copied in multiple locations instead of actively moving or teleporting between them. Crimson Desert is designed to make Pywel feel like a living place where exploration yields genuine discovery, but some of these technical issues undermine that goal by breaking the illusion at regular intervals throughout the experience. At its core, Crimson Desert is a sandbox adventure that succeeds at being a sandbox adventure. It fails at being a traditional RPG because it isn't trying to be one. The confusion around its identity obscured both its genuine strength and its very real weaknesses, and the critical reception reflected that confusion rather than the quality of the game itself. Pearl Abyss delivered what they promised. The market verdict and the critical verdict diverged because reviewers judged Crimson Desert against standards it never set for itself. The open world rewards verticality and curiosity. The life skills integrate with progression in meaningful ways. Combat emphasizes experimentation and fun. The 5 major life skills connect exploration, preparation, and combat into very satisfying loops. The movement mechanics are ambitious, but somewhat unreliable. Core systems often go unexplained. Boss difficulty is heavily gear-gated with poor communication about it. The Abyss magnifies those traversal issues, and narrative pacing is slow and lethargic for most of the beginning of the game. All in all, Crimson Desert delivers exactly what it promises: a sandbox adventure with exceptional world design. It rewards exploration and punishes rushing. It trusts you as the player to explore and experiment and doesn't often teach you how. And if you can play the game with all of this in mind, you'll have a lot of fun because this game is well worth the time and money. Feel free to leave your thoughts and feedback in the comments below. I always appreciate it, and it really does help me make something you can trust and value to give you as much useful analysis and information as possible when you're planning to buy and play a game with your hard-earned money. Hit the subscribe button and the bell button and whichever thumb you think this video deserves. As always, my people, take care of yourselves.